Now, in this episode, what was the impact of Renaissance poetry, which is in your syllabus? So, in poetry, the impact was of various nature, and you have to understand them, how it was, in what manner it was. Of course, you have to know it in details, or otherwise you will not be able to follow it. So that is very important to know. Now, what was the impact of Renaissance poetry? In poetry, the spirit of Renaissance can be seen in the works of Watt, Surrey, Spencer, Sidney. Who are they, if you ask me? I will tell you but one thing. They are all sonneteers. And in that respect, they are very much important. Shakespeare. So this form became a fashionable and handy tool for the great poets of this age. Sir Thomas Watt and Earl of Surrey were the pioneers of the new poetry in England. The most important techniques that established during the Renaissance were known as fumato, chiaroscuro, perspective, foreshortening, and proportion. So perhaps one of the most important inventions of the Renaissance period is the printing press, which marked a paradigm shift in education and literature. During the Renaissance, there were many new inventions and discoveries made which changed the way of life of the people. That has to be kept in mind. Change the life of the people. So, or looked at things. Many argue that the ideas, characteristics of this Renaissance poetry were manifold and had the origin in the late 13th century Florence. In particular, in the writings of Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321, and Petrarch, 1304 to 1374. Italian prose of the 13th century was as abundant and varied as its poetry. So that has to be also to be kept in mind. And the founder of the Renaissance was Petrarch. Petrarch was one of the founders of the Renaissance period. So his name comes in the foremost position. He is an eminent writer of the Renaissance period. He is known as the father of the Renaissance, Petrarch. So the magnum of Petrarch is Secretum, Secretum. Petrarch is often considered the founder of humanism. Who was the famous Renaissance writer? The greatest writer of the Renaissance and perhaps in all of history was William Shakespeare. Born in England around April 1564, Shakespeare was a playwright, poet, and actor. His works comprise of over 150 sonnets and nearly 40 plays, including Romeo, Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, and many more. The Renaissance was a fervent period of economic rebirth following the Middle Ages, generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century. The Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. The four characteristics of the features of the Renaissance period are the advent of new and powerful ideas of humanism, rationalism, scientific spirit, and spirit of inquiry. A wide range of musical styles and genres or nodes, or genres we say it, or genres we say it, flourished during the Renaissance, including masses, motets, motets, madrigals, madrigals, chansons, chansons, accompanied songs, instrumental dances, and many others. Beginning in the late 20th century, numerous early music assemblies or ensembles were formed. Gathering, ensembles means gathering. A few main themes that can guide your discussion of all the major Italian Renaissance works includes the revival of the classical styles and ideas, especially humanism, return to the naturalistic style, 3D objects and space, and the rising status of the individual, both artist and patron. What is the origin of the Renaissance literature? Sometimes such questions do arise. Origin literature. The literature of the Renaissance was written within the general movement of the Renaissance, which arose in the 14th century Italy and continued until the mid 17th century in England, while being diffused into the rest of the Western world. The literature and the poetry of the Renaissance was largely influenced by the developing science and philosophy. The humanist Francesco Petrarch, a key figure in the renewed sense of scholarship, was also an accomplished poet, publishing several important works of poetry. So, the Renaissance and Reformation both are together if we take it to be, because that is in your syllabus and the university syllabus. That is the Renaissance period, 14th to 17th century, meaning rebirth or revival. Historical period of approximately 300 years marked by a revival in art, literature, and learning. So the period served as a bridge or transition between medieval and modern Western Europe. Distinctive feature, it began with the rediscovery of Greco-Roman civilization, which had been neglected during the Middle Ages. It emphasized reason, a questioning attitude, experimentation, and free inquiry. This is contrasted with the medieval concern with faith, authority, and tradition. It glorified the individual and approved worldly pleasures, viewing life as a worthwhile for its own sake, not chiefly as a preparation for the life to come, that is salvation. Focused attention upon secular society rather than medieval preoccupation with the church and religious affairs. Featured great achievements in literature, art, and science. So, origin, it had been the center of Greco-Roman culture. Italy contains sculpture, buildings, roads, and manuscripts that excited curiosity about classical civilization. Located on the Mediterranean, Italy had absorbed stimulating new ideas from the more advanced Byzantine and Muslim worlds. So if you visit Turkey or that place, you will come under the Byzantine influence. So, benefiting from the revival of trade that resulted from the Crusades, Italy had wealthy, influential people who became patrons, supporters of literature, art, and science. The leading patrons, who were they? Certain popes in Rome, the Forza family in Milan, SFORZA family in Milan, the Medici family in Florence. Now, Florence, preeminent Renaissance city, 15th century, Florence came under the control rule of the Medici family. Originally a merchant family who amassed a fortune in the wool trade and then expanded into banking. So the Medici family, especially Lorenzo the Magnificent, became outstanding patrons of Renaissance art. He was 1469 1492 within this period. Florence attracted people of talent from elsewhere in Italy, and the city acquired many priceless works of art. So the Renaissance spread in the 15th century. Renaissance idea began to spread from Italy to France, the German states, Holland, and England. The spread of these ideas resulted from religious, military, and commercial contacts. Many northern scholars also traveled to Italy to absorb Italian art and learning. Humanism, when we talk about, it illustrated the spirit of Renaissance, a literary movement that began in the 14th century Italy, concerned themselves not with the religious matters, but with everyday human problems, drew inspiration from classical civilization, eagerly seeking, studying, and publicizing ancient Greek and Roman scriptures, manuscripts, you can say, revived interest chiefly among the educated people in literature and writing. Who are the earliest humanist writers? Again, the name comes Petrarch, 1304 1374. He lived for 70 years. Italian who studied the classic and wrote in both Italian and Latin. Petrarch initiated the style of classical writers. Pico della Mirandola was another one, 1463 1494. He was also an Italian who lived for a while near Florence. Was a scholar of law, philosophy, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. He spoke in praise of the dignity of human beings. Erasmus, the third one. He was in 1466 to 1536. He was a Dutch and brilliant classical scholar. So in his book Praise of Folly, he ridiculed superstition, prejudice, upper class privileges, and church abuses. By satirizing social evils, Erasmus encouraged people to think about reforms. Then, of course, the fourth one comes is Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, an Englishman who wrote Utopia, a book about an ideal country that was free from war, injustice, poverty, and ignorance. Practically, it is impracticable. Then comes the vernacular replaces Latin in literature. In Middle Ages, Latin was the language of the literature, of the church, and of educated people. Over the centuries, other languages had been evolving through everyday usage. At the end of the Middle Ages, writers began to use the vernacular. Who are the writers of the vernacular? First name will come Dante, 1265 to 1321. An Italian born in France, served that city in various governmental positions until he was exiled by political opponents. He is known as the father of modern Italy, Dante. He was the first to write an important piece of literature in the vernacular. Dante is famous for his Divine Comedy, a long poem in which Dante describes an imaginary trip through hell, purgatory, and heaven, during which one of his guides is the Roman poet Virgil. If you read it, you'll really get interest into it. Particularly, I got interested into it. It was so very real. His imagination, his fancy worked wonders. Trip through hell, purgatory, and heaven. Then the second name that comes after Dante, writer of the vernacular, the second name is Boccaccio. Boccassio. Boccaccio, 1313 to 1375. Maybe his date of birth is a question. He's also an Italian who lived in Florence during the formative years and was influenced by the Renaissance spirit of humanism. He is best known for Italian prose in a collection of short stories called the Decameron, capital Decameron. These stories were related by a group of young men who fled to a villa outside Florence to escape the Black Death. What is this Black Death? Plague. Plague, the horrible disease, believed to be from the rats, emanating from the rats. Then the third important person is Chaucer, 1340. Again, his date of date of birth is a question mark, to 1400. An Englishman who became familiar with the works of Dante and Boccaccio. So you will find Boccaccio referred to in his writings. Boccaccio that has been referred to his writings. There are many references to his writings on this Boccaccio. While traveling in Italy, Chaucer used English in his collection of stories in verse, the Canterbury Tales. Supposedly, these stories were related by pilgrims journeying to the religious shrine at Canterbury. The invention of printing encourages literature. It happened so in 1450. Printing and movable type was invented by a German John Gutenberg, famous man in printing. During the Middle Ages, books had to be hand copied, time consuming, expensive, on parchments of goat skin. It was written. It is known as parchment. 12th century Europeans discovered paper from the Muslims. Impact was printing tremendously increased output and accuracy and decreased the cost. Inexpensive printed material afforded all people opportunities for literacy and learning and encouraged talented people to write. Renaissance literary achievements. You can name Machiavelli, an Italian born in Florence, served the Florentine Republic as a secretary and diplomat. When the Medici family was restored to power in Florence, Machiavelli was dismissed from office and permitted to retire to his country home where he devoted himself to writing. Then comes the name The Prince, major work on ethics and government he had written, describing how rulers maintain power by methods that ignore right or wrong and accept the philosophy that the end of justice, the means. So, these are the facts. The word Machiavellian has come to mean cunning and unscrupulous, a prototype for a totalitarian dictator, right or left wing. We call them Machiavellis. Then the other name, Renaissance literary achievement, the other name will come across after Machiavelli is Rabelais, Rabelais, 1494-1553, a Frenchman who wrote the romance Gargantua and Pantagruel. The names are very peculiar, very difficult to utter, undoubtedly. He was a humorist who portrayed a comic world of giants, whose adventures satirized education, politics, and philosophy. Then comes a very important name, Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, a Frenchman who wrote a series of essays. He expressed skepticism towards accepted beliefs, condemning superstition and intolerance and urging people to live nobly. Then the name, important name is Cervantes, 1547 to 1616. He is a Spaniard who ridiculed feudal society, especially knighthood and chivalry, in relating in the adventures of the Mad Knight of La Mancha and Don Quixote. You know about this Don Quixote. It's a very famous name. Cervantes had written this Quixote, Quixote, Quixote. It's even a name today. The most important is the fifth person, Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. His plays employ the dramatic technique to probe historical events and human character. His best known plays can be divided into many parts. Histories like Henry IV and Henry V, comedies like Twelfth Night and Midsummer Night Dream, tragedies, tragedies like Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and Macbeth. After him, important is Milton, 1608 and 1674. Milton was an Englishman. Paradise Lost retold the biblical story of creation of the Garden of Eden in this epic poem. Then is important pamphlet, paper we say, Areopagitica, Areopagitica, in which Milton advocated freedom of the press. That is the first journalism, we say, is Areopagitica. Then comes the name of Molière, 1622 and 1673. He dominated French literature as its leading comic dramatist. Best known plays The Misanthrope and The Imaginary Invalid. So we have come across these various people, great men who were involved in this Renaissance period. And characteristics of Renaissance art was influenced artistic achievements of classical Greece and Rome, particularly in sculpture and architecture. Renaissance artists often imitated classical works. Renaissance painting emphasized realism, attention to detail, and a desire for perfection. Early Renaissance painters dealt with religious themes but with a lifelike approach. Later Renaissance painters also employed a realistic style and continued to recreate biblical themes. In addition, they also depicted worldly subjects, landscapes, portraits, and scenes of everyday life. Artistic achievements of the Renaissance. We should start with Italian. Famous person was Giotto, Giotto, 1266 to 1337. He was a painter and architect born near Florence. Portrayed religious themes in many frescoes, wall paintings. He also designed the Cathedral of Florence with its famous bell tower known as the Giotto's Tower. Then comes Ghiberti, Ghiberti, 1378 to 1455. He was also Florentine who sculpted a series of exquisite biblical scenes for the bronze doors of the baptistry in Florence. Then comes Donatello, 1386 to 1466. A Florentine sculptor, he was best known for his life-size statue of St. George. Leonardo da Vinci, he is the most famous painter, 1452 to 1519. He worked in Florence, Milan, and Rome. He was a skilled painter, sculptor, architect, musician, engineer, and scientist. In military engineering, he improved the method of loading cannons and devised equipment for scaling walls. That was Leonardo da Vinci. He devised the possibility of a parachute and a flying machine. In painting, he is best known for the self-portrait, The Last Supper, and the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci. Self-portrait, The Last Supper, and the Mona Lisa. Then the most important of all artists, Michelangelo, 1475 to 1564. He worked in Florence and Rome. He was talented as a painter, sculptor, poet, and architect. Famed for the biblical scenes he painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. It is still there. Those who visit the Vatican, they can see the paintings that was done some 600 years ago. As a sculptor, he is best known for his Pieta, Pieta, David, David, and Moses, Moses. So Michelangelo also designed the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He is a very famous designer of this dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Then comes Titian, 1477 to 1576. A painter associated with Venice and known for his portraits of famous people and his scenes from mythology and the Bible, such as the Assumption of the Virgin. So you have to appreciate his approach. And there's no denial of the fact that he was a master of his arts. Then comes Raphael. Raphael is also a famous poet, a famous painter. We come across him in many of Tennyson's poems referred to. Not Tennyson, Browning. Worked in both Florence and Rome. Known for the frescoes he painted in the Papal Library at Rome. Then comes the Spanish artists. First name is El Grasso, a Greek who settled in Spain. Painted religious scenes such as the Assumption, portraits of church officials, and the famous landscape view of Toledo. Then come Velasquez, Velasquez, again Spanish. Official painter to the court of King Po of Spain, also did many paintings of royalty. He commemorated a Spanish victory against the Dutch in the surrender of Breda. The next name is the name of the Dutch artists. Hals, Captain HALS, 1518 to 1666. Painted portraits of ordinary people and scenes of everyday life. His famous is Laughing Cavalier. Rembrandt is also a very famous name, considered the greatest painter of the Northern Europe. Portrayed everyday life and common people in his paintings. His notable works are The Night Watch, The Anatomy Lesson, and Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. Then comes the Flemish Rubens, Rubens, 1577 to 1640, depicted action in religious and historical paintings. He is famous for the adoration of the Magi. Now, this is all about art that we discussed. In the Renaissance period, there was scientific development also. Early Middle Ages, superstition and belief in alchemy held back scientific development. The people could not admit it. The practice and use of experimentation, observation, and the use of mathematics were introduced in the late Renaissance. Scientists formed societies to discuss and publish their discoveries. Famous is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci anatomy dissected bodies of executed criminals at first to improve his paintings. There are many stories about him. Learned much about the human body. Leonardo da Vinci is also supposed to have spent his life in the cemetery dissecting dead bodies, devised pumps and canals, attempted to discover the scientific principles behind waves, invented improved cannons, movable bridges, and even an armored vehicle. Never published the results of his experiment. He kept it within himself, his experiments. Then the famous person is Copernicus. You heard the name in astronomy. Aristarchus, 200 BC, theorized that the sun was the center of the universe. Theory of heliocentric was postulated by Ptolemy, Ptolemy, hundreds AD. Theorized the earth was the center of the universe. Then the theory of geocentric came. The Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus published on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. He supposed the heliocentric theory of planetary revolution. He was not believed, it appeared, to disagree with the logic, and the church disagreed with it also. Unable to prove his theory, he had to publish an introduction stating it was only a possible alternative to Ptolemy theory. You have all heard the name of Kepler and Galileo. Those who have read Galileo, as I have read it, you'll understand what does it stand for. What is this Galileo for? Why is Galileo so famous? That is to be understood. Why does he become so famous? In his works, there's a reason behind it. He has certain inbuilt talent. Early 1600, Kepler proved Copernicus correct, but only mathematically. He discovered that revolutions were not circles but were ovals. Galileo made a telescope from work that had been done by a Dutchman. It is said that he copied from a Dutchman. He had to suffer a lot for copying. He observed mountains and valleys on the moon, rings around the Saturn, and that Jupiter's moons revolved around it. I read Galileo totally. 1632, Galileo published the dialogue of the two great systems of the world. Church opposition, Galileo was called before the Inquisition and was forced to recant of faith, being accused of heretic. Heretic in those days by the church, when declared, meant something very serious. Galileo also discovered that all objects fall at the same time, same speed, when friction and air are absent. Frictionless it was. After that comes the Protestant Reformation. So long we spoke about Renaissance. Now the Protestant Reformation, religious revolt against the authority and certain doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. Protestant, a Christian who is not of the worth of the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox faith. Causes of Reformation was political. Resentment of the church courts and claims of supremacy over civil authority. At that time, church was very powerful. Nationalism, the Pope was considered to be a foreign ruler with no right to interfere in the affairs of other nations. But it did so. There was an economic cause, jealousy of the church wealth. Church was very wealthy and powerful. Desire to confiscate church property. The tithi or tithe, T-I-T-H-E, too heavy a burden for the people. Also, constant flow of money out of the country to the papacy, that is the church, the Pope. Prohibiting archery restricted the growth of business. Intellectual impact of the Renaissance, individualism, a desire for direct relationship between individual and God. Questioning attitude, some doubted the church's religious authority powers. Church abuses were rampant. Worldliness, even today we find in the mosque, we find it so in the temple, we find it in the church. These are all abuses, but church abuses during the time. Worldliness, materialistic life of some popes and higher clergy. The popes led a very high life. Not only money, women was also involved in it. Nepotism was the appointing of relatives to church positions. Simony of selling appointments to church offices. Sale of indulgences, that is accepting money for church forgiveness of sins. If you have to be forgiven of your sins, church will take money from you and forgive you, so you are forgiven. Indulgences, a grant of forgiveness for the sins committed during the Crusades. So naturally, there was a decline of church prestige. There was Babylonian captivity, 1309 to 1377. Papacy headquartered in Avignon, France, under the domination of the French king. So great schism had taken place, that is 1378 to 1417. Rival popes at both Avignon and Rome, claiming to be the true pope and struggling for church supremacy. There were indulgences everywhere. Renaissance popes began the practice of selling them in order to meet financial needs. Pope Leo X needed funds for the rebuilding of the St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. In northern Germany, John Tetzai, a Dominican monk, is also held responsible. Claimed indulgence would not only bring pardon for sins, but also pardon for sins not yet committed. So, till here, if we learn or whatever we have learned, it is true that there was rampant corruption everywhere. Then after that comes, everything comes Martin Luther. Maintained that Tetzal's claims were contrary to church doctrines. Martin Luther was the teacher of theology at Wittenberg University, at that time the famous university. Shocked at the tactics of Tetzal, refused to grant forgiveness when presented with an indulgence. Luther's 95 Thesis is very famous. Started his position on the question of indulgences. It was an invitation for scholars to debate the issue with him. This action is viewed as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Then The famous man John Eckhamp refused to deal with the question of indulgences. Admission attempted to force Luther to state whether he was a rebellious clergyman or not. Luther was asked if he would accept the decision of a church council. Luther said he would appeal to the teachings found in the Bible. So there was only two alternatives for Luther: admit he was wrong and ask for forgiveness. Break with the church in Rome. Luther issued an open declaration to the rulers of Germany. He attacked the church as a religious and political institution. He encouraged them to reform the church within their borders. He also said that they should forbid interference by the Pope in the affairs of their own states. So the Pope excommunicated Luther. Luther translated the New Testament into German, wrote many pamphlets criticizing the church and appealing to German nationalism. Lutheran doctrine became famous during the time. How can salvation be achieved? It was the first question. Catholic through good works and the sacraments. Lutheran justification by faith. Salvation would be granted through faith alone. Luther retained only two sacraments, baptism and communion. He maintained that the others were not authorized in the Bible. There was a reaction to Luther. Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, called for a meeting of a diet in the city of Worms in 1521. It issued the Edict of Worms. This edict prohibited the printing and sale of Luther's works and for anyone to give and shelter to Luther. So when a man is right in his way, in his approach, in his knowledge, he is defied. The edict was openly defied in areas of the German states, Holy Roman Empire. In 1529, another diet met, ended toleration for Lutherans in the Catholic German states. The civil war broke out after Luther's death in 1546. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 followed. Individual rulers would decide which religion his people would follow, Catholic or Lutheran. So the Protestant rulers could keep all the church land seized prior to 1552. Lutheranism was the only recognized Protestant creed. Bishops and abbots who had become Protestant had to resign and give up their land. It remained the property of the Catholic Church. Lutheranism spread to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and it became the established church in Norway and Sweden. So, today, we'll end it up over here only. Because if we continue with the discussion will continue.